Thank you so much, Professor Gayatri, for joining us. You've done a lot of work on the gig economy and what it's like to be one of God knows, millions of people who are working in this sector. Just to start, I wanted to ask you if you can, for our audience also, just give us a very general, what is the major distinguishing or distinctive feature of a gig economy worker as compared to regular traditional forms of employment, apart from the fact that obviously it's more or less app based. What are the
Yeah.
other distinguishing features?
Okay. So I think that's a good way to actually start this conversation out
Yeah.
because typically when we think about what gig work is and the transition of this work being found on online platforms, one of the kind of narratives that has surrounded it is to suggest that there is some kind of significant break that happens between previous forms of employment and then what we see as gig work, right?
Yes.
And I think particularly when we look at the Indian context or even global South, if we were to extend it out,
Yeah.
where informal work is very common, by which we mean work without contracts, short-term employment, right? Even daily kind of waged work, etc. We notice that there is actually a far more, spread of continuity
Hmm.
between
Hmm.
informal work and gig work,
Hmm.
rather than any kind of major disruption or break that we actually notice.
All right.
So when we typically use the word gig work, we are referring to because it began in reference to kind of forms of work that were organized around digital platforms that were being sought on digital platforms. So we tend to associate it with that. But I think technically and legally, if we were to really put it to the test, we
Hmm.
would notice that this is not really any new form of employment,
Hmm.
but essentially an extension of informal work.
Hmm.
With perhaps a caveat that I would add here that there is a sort of suggestion or
Hmm.
a certain facade of greater flexibility that is provided to the worker rather than to the employer. So
Hmm.
typically when we talk about informal work, we also know that it is work where it can be carried out on the whims and fancies of the employer and, and depending on how long they want to hire you for, how much
Yeah.
they pay you for, so
Yeah.
on and so forth. In gig work, it has come with this kind of huge amount of discourse to suggest that flexibility is now going to be reversed. And
Hmm.
this is flexibility that is going to be provided to the worker.
Okay.
And of course, again, there is some ability of workers to choose when they want to log in and work, etc.
Hmm.
But I think increasingly what we notice is that over years of operation. So in the first few, years of gig work being introduced via certain platforms, this flexibility may be possible
Hmm.
to a fair extent for workers.
Yeah.
But as the platform itself gets more established in a particular country, in a particular context,
Hmm.
that flexibility is sort of withered away.
Hmm.
And then we see this kind of, continuity emerging far more strongly between informal work and between gig work.
This flexibility point is, I think, slightly related. I don't know if you would agree with the assertion. The biggest one of the major legal bones of contention is this defining this employee-employer relationship. So they're saying that if it's a flexible relationship because these are not really employees, these are quote unquote independent contractors. This has been obviously a source of many legal battles and regulatory battles and all of that. I want to know, like, what is the kind of because from the outside it looks like a very like it's like a no-brainer. It's like, why are we having this question at all? Like these are clearly workers or employees, but the tech companies and the platforms have been very eager. They've been very keen to continue this distinction. What is the reason why they are so wedded to this idea that no, these are not employees but independent contractors?
It's a very simple sort of argument that they have, right? Like
Hmm.
for them, the logic of this is that you need to build a lean platform, a lean company, right? And a lean company is sort of created from the ground up
Hmm.
by stating very clearly that you have far fewer employees than you do, right? So
Hmm.
it's not
Hmm.
that platforms don't have regular employees.
Hmm. Hmm.
Your
Yeah.
coders, your
Yes. Yes.
management, etc., are going to be
Absolutely.
part of the regular employees,
True.
but you do not want to include the bulk of your workers who are going to be the gig workers who are actually carrying out these services
Yeah.
into your company and recognize them as employees because that disrupts this logic of being a lean platform, right? So the companies are sort of, tech corporates are kind of suggesting that they are simply a marketplace where the service provider and the client come together and meet, right?
Yeah.
Now, legally, if that was to be the case, then the terms on which the service provider, that is a gig worker, engages with the client would be determined by these two parties alone, right?
Mm.
But the platforms obviously intervene far more strongly.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that, in all these legal tests that are being carried out,
Mm.
it started in the US,
Yeah.
in California,
Yeah.
Italy, UK, right? Everywhere. I think in Indian law as well, if one were to test this, it would be very, very evident that these are actually employees and there's no two ways about it, right?
Yeah.
But it literally will threaten like basically any projected profits of platforms to actually take on board these workers as employees. So in fact, if you look at the when Zomato went public,
Yeah.
and they released their red herring prospectus, right?
Mhm.
In their prospectus, they actually stated this as a potential market risk that if Indian law was to change and recognize now gig workers as potential employees, this was going to be a market risk because it will threaten the kind of profits that they draw. Because then you don't have to provide,
Mm.
you don't have to look at things like minimum wages. You don't have to provide any kind of sort of investment towards maintaining decent work conditions. You don't have to provide social security support, right? So all of those can come to be minimized to a large extent by declaring them as independent contractors.
Mm.
And legally and financially, you can free yourself of that responsibility. And that's therefore the route that these platforms have chosen to undertake, right?
Okay.
But I think when put to the test, it's very, very evident that it does not stand.
So here's the next thing. I think I'm not a legal scholar by any means, but like you're saying, like when if it's put to a legal test, it's very obvious that the relationship impact is of an employee-employer. So since that has not happened, since we are not making that step to actually recognizing the reality of that reality of that relationship, is that a reason? The reason for that, the fact is that the government attitudes towards business is more towards the tech business side and less towards the working population and the laboring classes.
Yes, partly. I mean, definitely, partly intent based in terms
Hmm.
of how they are looking at it as a boost of business, also as a boost of jobs. I think in
Yeah.
India, one of the things that one notices is that repeated statements from the state coming out to suggest that this is a form of valuable job opportunities, right?
Hmm.
When in fact, what is it that you are really putting out as an equivalent for a job, an
Yeah.
extremely short-term sort of opportunity that exists that may or may not translate into any kind of livable wage or income that a worker receives,
Hmm.
often conducted under extremely vulnerable conditions, right, by a variety of workers. So there is definitely a certain level of intent on the part of the state to not regulate on this matter, to really
Okay.
sort of step back and
Yeah.
deregulate on this.
Hmm.
And this is uniform, right? So this is
Yeah.
not just about India, but this is globally as well
Yes.
that this
Yes.
is, we notice that this is really happening. And when I say that if we put it to the test,
Hmm.
what I mean is that, if we look at labor laws and, this is a commonality that we see in labor laws in different countries as well, is that typically when we want to understand what is the relationship between an employer and an employee, one of the big markers of that is to say, does your employer have the right to determine how your work is conducted, right? And once you are able to establish that your employer is able to tell you that, okay, I expect, this to be conducted, this sort of work to be conducted in,
Hmm.
say X amount of time. You must, in the course of conducting this duty, let's say, greet a customer, wear a certain uniform, operate in, carry a certain kind of bag, so on and so forth. All
Hmm.
of the things which basically platforms mandate
Yeah.
for gig-based workers, then it is evidence of the fact that there is a degree of control being exercised. So when
Yes.
we look at that exercise of control, it's evident to us. But there is increasingly pushback, of course, from platforms themselves,
Hmm.
and a lack of inclination, I think, from various states to actually regulate this industry. Partly it forms, the kind of action that they take around tech corporates in general, and then platforms is one part
One
of it.
part of it.
So there is a certain hesitancy in actually regulating any kind of tech corporations, and we know this from the US, we know this
Yeah.
from UK, India, etc. But a large part of that, I think, in the Indian context, is definitely rooted in thinking of this as providing job opportunities in an economy where there are very few actually stable jobs that are being created.
Okay. I'm going to come to this particularly the background in which all of this is happening a little bit later. But first, I want to talk about like one of the major turning points in this entire story is obviously the COVID pandemic. And you've
Yes.
written quite a lot about what happened. I mean, everybody was aware that at the same time as, these people, especially the food delivery people were deemed, essential workers and all. Platforms were busy slashing incentives, putting all kinds of onerous requirements on them. How really, matlab, it felt like a turning point for the industry as a whole. How really do you see how did the pandemic change the platform, the workers? How did it change our entire perception of what the gig work in general?
Okay. I think it's been transformative, really, what
Hmm.
has happened during the pandemic. So, first, in terms of what happened with the work itself, right? I think one of the main factors that brought in a lot of these changes during the pandemic
Hmm.
was also the fact that at the same point of time, people were losing jobs in other sectors.
Yes.
And often, I mean, this is something that I came across in a lot of my interviews,
Yeah.
that people were turning to gig work simply as a stopgap measure because they had lost other jobs, right? So in the face of like no other job being available during the periods of the lockdown, food delivery was operational. And so a lot of people actually did turn to food delivery at this point of time, right? And of course, when you have this inundation of people into seeking work, this is also, platforms also operate on the logic of a certain kind of labor surplus being available, right? So that for customers, because time is such a crucial factor with how these services operate,
Hmm.
they are keen to have a large labor force that is onboarded onto the platforms,
Yeah.
right? And I think something very interesting that we notice in India is that there is documentation of the fact that gig workers increased during this period of time, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
people were increasingly turning to this form of job,
Hmm.
which allows platforms which were anyway, on a trend of slowly sort of reducing incentives, reducing base pays,
Hmm.
removing certain other kinds of extra payments,
Hmm.
offers, etc., that were made to workers. That trend was already on from, say, about Jan 2020 onwards, especially in food delivery platforms. It sort of amped up. It got, much more amped up during the periods of the lockdown when a lot of these rates were further reduced, right? And they could do it in knowledge of the fact that there are, if you choose to leave, there are 10 other workers lined up
Yeah.
for this kind of work, right? So that was a major effect. But
Hmm.
I think one other very significant impact of the pandemic has been that because these changes were so rapid, right? Workers were being marked as essential, put on the front line essentially, engaging in work that brought them into direct contact with others without providing any protection to themselves. They were often, food delivery workers often spoke about police harassment because,
Yes.
during lockdowns, crossing 1 2 kilometer radiuses, you would encounter police,
Hmm.
who would
Hmm.
often attack you.
Yeah.
All kinds of things were happening. So all of this really also contributed to a very strong momentum towards worker collectivization.
Yes. Yes.
During this period, we also noticed that, the period from, I think, March till about September 2020 onwards, there were a number of strikes that were breaking out
Hmm.
in different cities,
Hmm.
primarily amongst delivery workers because they were the ones active, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of these were just wildcat strikes,
Yeah.
workers really just coming together and, immediately kind of pushing back against some kind of policy change that had happened from the platform, to demand better measures for themselves, better work conditions for themselves, etc.
Yeah.
But this also set off really the foundations for stronger collectivization, by which I mean organizing either, in self-organized associations or collectives, joining up with larger unions, registering of new unions of gig workers. All of
Yeah.
this has happened during that period of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So it's been an extremely critical period in thinking about how gig work actually operates in the Indian context. And I think, therefore, we saw some of the most strident and some of the most significant worker collective actions at this point of time. Urban
Yeah.
Company, women workers, for
Yeah.
instance, over 100 of them, striking in October, then
Mm.
again repeatedly December. And then you notice also how platforms are responding at this point of time. So what
Yeah.
begins with, a little bit of bargaining in the beginning, eventually by the end of 2020, Urban Company, for instance, filed a suit against four of its workers
Yeah.
for protesting, right? And for instigating wider protest and they claim violence, etc. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a very, very formative period in terms of thinking about what is the context of gig work in India. And I think a lot of what we see later, which is, for instance, the Rajasthan gig workers bill that has come about, the fact that you have a Karnataka government taking account of gig workers, Telangana now doing so, the fact that during state election campaigns or during Bharat Jodo Yatra, etc., efforts were
Mm-hmm.
being made to meet with gig workers, I
Yeah.
think is a sign that they were an urban constituency of workers who could no
Yeah.
longer be. So
Yeah.
it's been really transformative in the sense of worker collectivization,
Yes. Yes.
but also in terms of work conditions. I think we noticed that the real extent of that, what I was saying earlier about worker control over workers,
Mm-hmm.
is something that also got sharpened very, very significantly during this time,
Yeah.
because there was a huge amount of protocol that now had to come around
Yeah.
the practice of work itself, right? So you couldn't simply just hand over. There had to be ways in which you handed the food over. You had to either leave it out or not. If you were a beautician entering somebody's house, you had to take selfies to show that you were
Yeah.
wearing a mask, you were
Yeah.
wearing a face guard, you were sanitizing your hands, the products you were using were fresh, all kinds of um, other minute kind of practices that were introduced supposedly in the name of safety.
Safety.
I'm not denying that some elements of them might have been to promote, safe contact between people. But what one notices very significantly is that the bulk of effort at maintaining safety was designed, at the bodies of workers
Yeah.
themselves,
Yeah.
not so much clients who are receiving that work, right?
Yeah.
So the presumption of who is carrying a disease, who is
Yeah.
bringing it to you, right? I think testifies to a lot of the underlying social hierarchies that we have around caste and class and how we operate. So the delivery people must not enter the lift,
Left.
right?
Yeah.
And this amplified during COVID to
Yeah.
say that we cannot share this kind of physical space with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And its
Yeah.
legacy continues. So it's not surprising to even now walk into a apartment building and find those kind of notices that say delivery boys should not be entering lifts, etc.
Yes. Yes.
So in that sense, I think the pandemic has been a very, very significant turning point when we think of gig work in India.
So what I also I think it's like the intensification both in terms of the quantitative intensification of work and but also this qualitative change in the nature of the work itself, and that inspiring the backlash from worker organizations and all of that. So there has been a tussle, there's been a back and forth, but on the whole, you feel that these practices, especially in the qualitative, like the control and all of these are kind of maybe workers were able to fight back against incentive changes as such. But like the idea of control has become so entrenched. Like in that sense, it is very difficult to roll that back. Go back to sort of pre-pandemic style of functioning. Would you agree with that?
Partly, yes. And I don't think it's because workers have not pushed back. There's
Hmm.
been,
Yeah.
especially in 23, 24, if we track the kind of protests that have been happening, a lot of them have been based on app-based management and the particular modes of control that have been
Yeah.
introduced through that,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But I think the reason why platforms are also able to, kind of push through all of this,
Hmm.
despite the protests, is again because of lack of other kinds of jobs and opportunities. So
Yeah.
ultimately, when you leave one platform, you are left with, you see, like the earlier kind of sectors of work that
Hmm.
you might have been a part of. Let's say if you were a taxi driver
Yeah.
and now you have become an Uber and Ola driver. your previous taxi industry has, in most cities, been decimated
Yeah.
through the coming of Uber and Ola, right? Or if you were a beautician, the salons have really declined,
Yeah.
right? So the lack of alternatives is a very a real deal that workers have to actually encounter to think of what really are your other alternatives. And typically your other alternatives are other platforms, where
Mm.
again, we know that in the early days of any platform,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
the incentives, the commissions, everything is far more lenient in order to draw workers in. And then as that base is created of enough workers, right, these policies begin to change.
Yeah.
So I think partly, of course, the fact that it's also been the writing is on the wall that the state is not inclined to actually legislate or regulate on any of this. So platforms also are aware that they are able to get away with a lot more.
Mm.
And so in many ways, these, pandemic introduced, practices have continued,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
it's not as though workers are not pushing back. So
Of
the
course.
pushback is constant, I think.
Mm.
And I think a lot of this, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in the coming days, because now there are, for instance, I'm aware of Delhi, which is
Mm.
where I conduct my field work.
Mm.
Urban company workers have filed cases in the district labor courts, right?
Okay.
Where no resolution was met. And this itself was a big step. In 2020, when I was interviewing workers, the district labor courts were refusing to take in any of these cases, saying we don't understand what this work is. We don't
Mm.
understand
Mm.
how these platforms are operating.
Yeah.
You're not really classified as an employee, so we don't even know whether legally we can take this on. But now, for instance, in Haryana, in Noida, these district labor courts have taken these cases on, right? And those are proceeding and ongoing. But it's a sign that that there is that the pushback is happening.
Yeah.
The change itself is obviously probably going to take longer to unfold. But definitely, it has strengthened the ability of, I think, platforms in a very, very rapid manner to
Mm.
introduce very strong surveillance measures,
Yeah.
using the guise of the pandemic and health and safety
Safety,
practices,
hygiene,
etc.
and all those things.
Yes,
This
yes.
this surveillance aspect I want to, because you've obviously in your fieldwork you've spoken to a lot of gig workers, and I want to understand like at a personal and psychological level, all of this being managed by an algorithm or an app, having all of this compulsions that you have to do, these steps you have to follow, being arbitrarily governed by arbitrary rating systems, which can have a direct and very immediate impact on your ability to stay on the platform. Extremely short delivery times, the pressure, working long hours, taking all kinds of unconscious risks that you have to take in order to complete all these jobs. What kind of a psychological or long-term psychological impact or toll does that take on a person who's working, has been in this industry for a while?
It's a very severe impact, and it's not just psychological, I'd say it's also physical.
Physical, yeah,
One,
yeah.
yeah, like one thing I used to constantly hear was that this is a young person's game. You can do
Mm.
it for a little while, but eventually your body starts taking a toll, because it is impossible, literally. You know what? The way in which the system operates is that essentially the choice of picking up gigs is left to you, right?
Mm.
But there will be stipulations of different platforms operate differently.
Yes.
But there could be on some platforms a stipulation of a minimum number of gigs that one is supposed to do, etc. And then, of course, there are your own internal calculations
Mm.
about how much are you making at the end of the day,
Yeah.
right? And as your incentive and base rates keep getting lowered, you are going to work longer and longer in order to make what you see as a livable income. So people, initially itself, it was quite evident that people are working 14, 18 hours a day. If you talk to somebody who does food delivery, they are riding on an average about 200 kilometers a day is what I used to hear. If you are a beautician, you are doing maybe 3 to 4 gigs, but it's physically intensive
Yeah.
work that you're doing. And of course, there's a lot of, in different ways it operates in different platforms, but there's also a lot of unpaid work that is demanded of workers, right? And in an effort to get your good ratings, you are compelled to do that. So, physically, it takes a massive toll on people. That's one aspect. The psychological aspect is interesting because this is something that we get a lot from literature around gamification and
Mm.
how that really operates. And you
Mm.
can see it play out in very similar ways because you are looking to hit certain incentive targets, right? You think that, okay, let me do one more gig, let me do two more gigs, and I'll hit my incentive of the date, right?
Mm.
So it's a shifting goalpost constantly. But what that also means is that sometimes workers tend to internalize that as their own, their own greed. So I used to often hear the word lalach, and they would
Mm.
say कि मेरे में लालच है कि मैं वो इंसेंटिव पा लूं इस दिन का, तो मैं
Mm.
कर
Mm.
करता रहता हूँ या करती रहती हूँ उस
Yeah.
दिन के लिए.
Yeah.
um, without realizing that you are essentially the algorithmic management itself is sort of compelling you,
Yeah.
right, in order to kind of work in a particular way and to give in far more than you actually have the mental or physical capacity to do. So it's extremely backbreaking work. It's extremely strenuous work. You're dealing with either external conditions, and I mean, look at
Yeah.
the climate that we are dealing with
Yeah.
these days. I mean, extreme heat, extreme cold.
Mm.
If you're talking about the fact that your work is a home-based service,
Mm.
there is an added factor of risk,
Risk.
especially
Yeah.
for women.
Exactly.
So all these kinds of external factors, which definitely take a toll, right? So there are, I mean, it's rare to find workers who can really see themselves as lasting in this as a long-term career. It is,
Mm.
you enter it, depending on when you have entered it also,
Mm.
it can quite, vary quite a bit.
Yeah.
Those who've entered in the earlier days when they've made, because in the early days, you really could earn quite decently on these platforms. For them, the idea was that they would stay on and they would continue, but now things have fallen apart. But for a lot of those who join this work now, there is no sense that this is long-term work, because you are very, very aware from the get-go that this is work that is going to do long-term harm ultimately, right? So you are
Mm.
always on the lookout for something else. And I think that's also something we don't talk about enough, that there is so much stress from holding out one job, but also constantly having to think about what next, right?
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
can also take a significant toll. And that's really the narrative of most gig workers, I think.
I want to talk about like what is the future that you see, how this industry developing over the next few years, and coming back to the context, the sort of social and economic context in which all of this is happening. The steady stream of low cost labor in this country is not going anywhere because,
Yes.
everybody knows, we're not creating any kind of high paying stable jobs. So, in a sense, any kind of negotiation that has to happen from workers, between workers, government, and the tech platforms is kind of undermined by these tech platforms understanding that they really, there's nothing that anybody can do. So, in that sense, is it in that knowing that, is it possible to if we have a willing government, let's say, is it possible to regulate away the most sort of obnoxious aspects of gig work, or is it structurally so dependent on low labor costs that there is no possibility of ethical, quote unquote, ethical gig work at all?
I mean, maybe I'm just an optimist, but I think there
No,
is a
we do
possibility.
encourage optimism on this
Yeah.
front. Yes, please go for it.
No, I think there is a possibility. I also think we need to recognize that we are not going to be able to turn back the clock here.
Yes.
It's not going to be entirely possible to say, completely eliminate these kind of platform-based
Hmm.
services and revert back to older practices that we had.
Yeah.
A large part of which is pretty much dependent on the fact that your urban consumers are now absolutely hooked onto
Hooked.
these. Yeah. So,
Yes.
you are expecting that you deliver, you will get your food delivery very
Absolutely.
easily, you get your groceries, your auto or your cab will come to your doorstep rather
Yeah.
than you walking. So all of this has clearly made there has been some kind of cultural shift in consumerism,
That's true.
as far as I can see.
That's
So it's
true.
going to be hard to go back to a previous era.
Hmm.
So I definitely think that there is a future for, more ethical practices to evolve. I also think that there are definitely elements of gig work that we should hold on to, right?
Hmm.
Just because platforms were not serious about flexibility for workers, doesn't mean we shouldn't sort of hold them
Yeah.
to it anymore, right? Why not? Why shouldn't we have flexible regimes for workers,
Hmm. Hmm.
where workers can actually choose when to work and how to work, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Essentially, you want a system where people have the ability to balance work and life in multiple ways. And structurally, as far as things go in terms of gendered work and gender division of labor, we know that this plays a big role for women. Women are looking for forms of work where they have some degree of freedom in determining when they work, how they work. And it's a big reason why so many women workers, for instance, as beauticians, spa technicians, etc., move to platforms, right?
Yes.
So these are valuable things to actually hold on to. But the point is that platforms themselves have never taken this seriously. So what are the ways in which we can legally enforce parts, partly what they are already saying they claim to do? So how
Yeah.
do we enforce that? The other part, I think, which is a little missing, I find in general in the, the kind of narrative even around regulating gig work that we have, is that a bulk of our conversation is only on social security. And that is very important for sure. But we cannot be ignoring this aspect of the kind of regulation we need on labor conditions itself, right? That there needs to be a certain minimum wage that benchmark that we create. We need to say that it is not going to be all right for someone to have to work 18 hours a day in order to make that minimum
Yeah.
wage,
Yeah.
right? We need to say what kind of work practices constitute safety for the worker, not for the consumer, because platforms have already taken care of that aspect, right? So what is it that you are going to provide in terms of safe work conditions, especially I think with outdoor forms of work, right? Where are the shelters that workers can, wait in? There's no waiting space. So, you are exposed to the outdoor elements. If you have temperatures of like 48, 49 degrees,
Yeah.
people have to wait between gigs, right? Why can't platforms create shelters for them, right?
That's
All of
true.
this was buzz and conversation that platforms said, but there is really no, there's no ability to actually hold them to that and be able to make them sort of see those promises through. So I think if you have a willing state, I think if you have a state that is willing to negotiate with platforms and bring them on board, which is seemingly possible because look at the social security
Yeah.
bills that have already happened. For instance, the Rajasthan one, there has been some element of being able to bring the platform on board as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So these are definite possibilities, but I think our biggest concern at this point, alongside social security, should be regulation of labor conditions. And I think this is actually the big tricky one, because to regulate labor conditions requires us to legally stipulate that bear a responsibility for this and that workers are not independent contractors. And this is always the sticking point. So it's not like platforms are going to come to the negotiating table very willingly on this. This is going to take a fair bit of tussle between state platforms, workers. But I think this is really the crux of the matter. So if we want to envision a future of work,
Yes.
in work, right? That future of work has to take into account what safe and reasonable working conditions look like for gig workers. And do that without having to eliminate the possibility of a degree of work, flexibility, of a degree of autonomy.
Yeah.
Because autonomy was, again, the big sort of buzzword that, platforms really entered with, to say workers will, because they're independent contractors, they can do it, conduct this work as they wish. But that at least they've stopped saying so much, more recently. But I think we should return back to that idea. What would
Yeah.
it mean to strip back on the levels of surveillance? And not just surveillance, but what would it mean to strip back on the levels of management that is actually operating over this form of work? Minimize that form of management, and really leave it up to workers and consumers to kind of set some of these terms themselves, while platforms are also playing a part in regulating and maintaining decent work conditions, such that workers are safe and consumers who receive these services are safe.